If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Ghost Whispers. The Man in the Crawl Space. It started with this weird smell in the house. I rent this small place on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. The smell wasn't strong at first, kind of like damp wood or old socks, so I figured it was the basement. The house has one of those creepy, unfinished crawl spaces that I never go into. You know the kind, bare dirt floor, cobwebs everywhere. I figured I'd check it out later, but honestly, I just kept putting it off. Who wants to crawl under their house, right? Then the noises started. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, creaking like it always does. But one night, I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard this distinct thud. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like something solid had hit the floor. I froze for a second, my heart pounding, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had gotten under the house? But then it happened again, like footsteps. Not random scratching or skittering like a raccoon, but actual footsteps. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to act normal, went to work, ran errands, but I kept hearing that sound in my head. By the time I got home, I'd convinced myself it was all in my imagination. But when I walked inside, that smell hit me again, stronger this time. It wasn't just damp, it was sour and human, if that makes sense. That's when I decided I couldn't put it off anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went out back to the small access hatch leading to the crawl space. I'd never been down there before, and honestly, I wasn't prepared for how creepy it was. The light barely cut through the darkness, and the dirt walls looked like something out of a horror movie. I crawled in slowly, sweeping the flashlight around. At first, I didn't see much, just pipes, some insulation, and a few old tools the last tenant must have left behind. But then my beam landed on something that didn't belong, a crumpled sleeping bag shoved into the far corner. Next to it, there were empty food wrappers, a water bottle, and a small notebook. My stomach dropped. Someone had been living under my house. I just sat there for a second, frozen, staring at the sleeping bag. The air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. I didn't want to move closer, but I couldn't leave without figuring out what the hell was going on. So, I inched forward, keeping the flashlight steady. The notebook was the first thing I grabbed. It was one of those cheap spiral-bound ones, and the cover was torn. When I opened it, I saw my name written at the top of the first page. I'm not kidding, my name. Not just that, but notes about me. My daily routine, what time I left for work, what time I came home, even what groceries I'd brought in on certain days. Flipping through the pages, I saw drawings of my house, diagrams of the rooms, even little scribbles about the things I watched on TV. I felt sick. My heart was racing, and I started to sweat even though it was freezing down there. Whoever wrote this knew everything about me. I couldn't stay down there any longer. I shoved the notebook under my arm, crawled out as fast as I could, and slammed the hatch shut behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely lock it. Back inside the house, I paced around, trying to decide what to do. Call the police? But what if they didn't take me seriously? I hadn't seen anyone, and it's not like I could prove the notebook belonged to whoever had been staying down there. Still, I couldn't sleep knowing someone might still be under my house. That night, I barely got any rest. Every little creak and groan from the house made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard something new, a faint scraping sound, like metal on wood, coming from below the floorboards. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. It stopped for a moment, then started again, louder this time. It sounded like someone was trying to pry open the hatch. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to grab my phone and call 911, but another part was too scared to move. What if they got in while I was waiting for help? I decided to grab the heaviest thing I could find, a baseball bat I kept in the closet, and crept toward the back door. My whole body was trembling, and I was trying so hard to stay quiet. The scraping stopped just as I reached the door, and everything went silent. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, this time coming from inside the crawl space itself. It wasn't scraping anymore, it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, right underneath where I was standing. I could feel the vibrations through the floor. My hands were slick with sweat, and I gripped the bat so hard my knuckles turned white. I was standing there, frozen, when I heard a low whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming up through the floorboards. That was it. I bolted for the front door and ran out into the street, leaving the house behind me. I stood outside in the freezing cold, staring at my house like it was some kind of predator waiting to pounce. My breath was coming out in short gasps, and I felt exposed under the dim glow of the streetlights. The whole neighborhood was dead quiet, no cars passing by, no lights on in the nearby houses. I kept expecting to see movement in one of the windows or someone crawling out from under the house, but nothing happened. After what felt like forever, I finally called the police. When the officers arrived, I told them everything. The noises, the notebook, the sleeping bag. They didn't look at me like I was crazy, which was a relief, but they also didn't seem too surprised. One of them said something about squatters, like it was a common thing. They went down into the crawl space while I waited outside, pacing nervously. It took them a while, but when they came back up, they said it looked like no one was down there anymore. They'd found the sleeping bag and trash, just like I described, but whoever had been living there was gone. The officers told me they'd file a report and suggested I get a padlock for the crawl space hatch. That was it. No sense of urgency. No plan to look for whoever had been living under my house. They left, and I was alone again, standing in the doorway, staring at the house like it was something alien. I wanted to go inside, to grab my things and maybe stay with a friend, but the idea of stepping back in there made my skin crawl. Eventually, I convinced myself to do it, thinking I'd just pack an overnight bag and leave. The house felt different. The air was heavier, and every shadow seemed alive. I walked through the room slowly, grabbing essentials and keeping the bat in my hand the whole time. When I got to my bedroom, something stopped me cold. Sitting on my pillow was the notebook. I know I left it in the crawl space. I didn't drop it. I didn't bring it back into the house. My head was spinning, and I backed out of the room. Slamming the door shut like that would somehow fix everything. I couldn't think straight. How the hell did the notebook get back inside? I wanted to believe I was just losing it, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Someone had been in my house, while I was outside waiting for the cops. The thought made my stomach churn. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, but as I passed the living room, I stopped dead. The hatch to the crawl space was open. Not just unlocked, but wide open, like someone had crawled out and left it that way. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I ran out of the house, not even bothering to lock the door behind me, and got into my car. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town, parked in the lot of an all-night diner. I sat there shaking, trying to convince myself to call someone. Anyone, but I didn't know what to say. Hey, I think someone's living under my house and stalking me didn't exactly roll off the tongue. I spent the rest of the night in that parking lot, staring at the diner lights, too scared to even go inside. The next morning, I drove back to the house, but I couldn't make myself go inside. I just sat in the car, staring at it. In the daylight, it didn't look as threatening, but that almost made it worse, like whatever had been in there was hiding, waiting for me to let my guard down. Eventually, I called my landlord and told him I wasn't staying there anymore. I didn't explain everything. I just said there was a break-in and I didn't feel safe. He grumbled about it, but said he'd check the place out later. I never went back. I left behind furniture, clothes, everything. A week later, the landlord called me, asking if I'd left the hatch open because he'd found it unlocked again. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just a raccoon or something, but I could hear the unease in his voice. I didn't tell him about the notebook or the whispering or how I'd felt someone watching me from the shadows of my own home. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But to this day, I can't walk past a crawl space without feeling that same suffocating dread. Late-Night Robbery by Fake Cops. It was a little past midnight, and the streets were quiet enough that my footsteps echoed against the brick buildings. I had just left my friend's place after a small get-together, taking my usual shortcut through a dimly lit alley that shaved off 10 minutes from the walk home. I had used it dozens of times before without incident, so I didn't think twice. About halfway through, I noticed a black car parked awkwardly at the alley's entrance, its headlights off. At first, I thought someone was taking a smoke break or something, but as I got closer, 2 men stepped out. Both wore dark clothes, one with a badge clipped to his belt and the other holding what looked like a flashlight. The one with the badge spoke first. "Hey, stop right there," he said, his voice sharp but not shouting. "Police." My stomach dropped. Something about them didn't feel right, but I froze anyway, instinctively raising my hands a little. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. They didn't look like regular cops. No uniforms, no marked car, but the guy with the badge held it up like he meant business. "We're undercover," he said, taking a step closer. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, so we need to check your ID." The second guy stayed quiet, standing slightly behind me as if to block my way. The whole situation felt wrong. My gut was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The flashlight guy leaned in closer, and that's when I noticed his hand hovering near his jacket pocket like he was ready to grab something. I fumbled for my wallet, trying to keep my hands steady. My brain was racing, analyzing every detail. How the badge looked a little too shiny, how their car didn't have a single marking, and how their body language screamed intimidation, not authority. The flashlight guy kept glancing over my shoulder like he was making sure no one else was around. "Let's see some ID," the first guy repeated, his tone sharper now. My instincts were practically yelling at me, but I pulled out my wallet anyway. I figured compliance might keep things from escalating. As I handed over my ID, he snatched it quickly, barely glancing at it before slipping it into his pocket. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Just a friend's place," I replied, trying to sound calm. But then he motioned toward my backpack. "What's in there?" My heart sank. "Just my phone, a book, some snacks," I stammered. "Open it," he demanded, his tone making it clear he wasn't asking. That's when it hit me. These guys weren't cops. Real police wouldn't act like this, wouldn't pocket someone's ID or pressure them this way. I hesitated, and the flashlight guy stepped forward, reaching out like he was about to snatch the bag from me. It was fight or flight time, and my body chose flight. Without thinking, I shoved past him, bolting down the alley as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me, and one of them yelled, "Stop! We'll shoot!" But no gunshots followed, which only confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't real cops. I didn't dare look back. The alley felt endless, and my backpack bounced against me as I sprinted. My breath burned in my chest, and every shadow in the dim light seemed like it might swallow me whole. When I finally burst out of the alley onto a main street, I nearly ran straight into a car. The driver honked, slamming on the brakes as I stumbled onto the sidewalk. I glanced back just in time to see the 2 men stop at the edge of the alley, clearly not wanting to step out where they could be seen. They turned back without a word, vanishing into the shadows. I kept running, not caring where I was going, just needing to put as much distance as possible between me and them. After a few blocks, I ducked into a 24-hour diner. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely type when I tried to text my friend. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the entrance and half expecting them to burst in, even though I knew it was unlikely. I was safe for now, but the fear stuck with me like a second skin. The waitress at the diner must have noticed how rattled I looked because she came over with a coffee I hadn't even ordered. "You okay, Han?" she asked, her tone cautious but kind. I nodded, though I must have looked like a wreck, sweaty, out of breath, and still glancing at the door every few seconds. "Yeah. Just had a rough night," I mumbled, not wanting to explain. As I sat there, the adrenaline started to wear off, and that's when I realized they still had my ID. My name, my address, everything. My stomach sank all over again. What if they came looking for me? What if this wasn't just some random robbery attempt, but something worse? I tried to convince myself they wouldn't go that far, that they'd probably just toss it after realizing I wasn't worth the trouble. But the thought of those two men knowing where I lived made it impossible to relax. I stayed in the diner until almost sunrise, too scared to leave. When I finally forced myself to head home, I took a cab instead of walking. Even as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be following me. That night, and for weeks after, I kept my curtains closed and jumped at every sound in the hallway. I never saw those men again, but I still can't walk alone at night without feeling like I'm being watched. The intruder on the porch. I don't even know where to start, but I guess I should just say this. I've never been the type to scare easily. I've lived in the same house for years. Quiet neighborhood, the kind where people wave to each other but mind their own business. That night, though, something changed. It was a little after midnight, and I just settled down in the living room to watch TV. My wife was asleep upstairs, and everything seemed perfectly normal, until I heard a noise on the front porch. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the chairs, but it didn't stop. It was this repetitive thumping sound, almost like someone was dragging their feet back and forth. When I peeked through the window by the front door, I froze. There was a man standing on the porch, his back to me, hunched over like he was looking for something on the ground. He was filthy. His clothes were torn and caked with dirt, and his hair was so matted it looked like it hadn't been washed in years. I remember thinking, why here? Why my house? I tapped on the window, just loud enough to get his attention, and he whipped around so fast it made me jump. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and unfocused, and his lips were moving like he was muttering something, but I couldn't hear through the glass. That's when it hit me. I had no idea how long he'd been there. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't just ignore him either. So, I cracked it open, just enough to talk through. "Hey, can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just stared at me with those glazed-over eyes. Up close, he smelled terrible, like mildew and something metallic, almost like blood. He muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't make it out. I told him he needed to leave, but he just kept shaking his head and whispering. I just need to find it," he said finally, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I can't leave until I find it." That sent a chill down my spine. I asked him what he was looking for, but he didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer to the door, and I instinctively shut it in his face. That's when he started pounding on it. Hard, like he was trying to break it down. I backed away, grabbing my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, the pounding stopped. It was dead silent. I went back to the window, expecting to see him gone, but he was still there, standing perfectly still, staring at the door like he was waiting for me to come back. I don't know why, but I was too scared to look away. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at him through the window, but it felt like forever. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his head slightly tilted, like he could hear something I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone, but I managed to dial 911. As I was talking to the operator, I saw him start to move again. Not towards the door, though. He crouched down on all fours like an animal and began crawling around the porch. His face pressed close to the wood, sniffing and muttering to himself. "He's still here," he kept saying over and over. "He's still here." The operator stayed on the line with me, but it felt like an eternity before the police finally arrived. The moment I saw the flashing lights, I felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last. As soon as the first officer stepped out of his car, the man on my porch shot up and bolted into the darkness. He moved so fast it didn't seem real, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The officers searched the area with their flashlights, but they didn't find him. One of them came back to the porch and asked me what had happened, and I tried my best to explain. I could tell he didn't believe me fully, especially when I mentioned the crawling. After the officers left, I locked every door and window in the house. They said they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I couldn't shake the image of that man crawling on all fours, sniffing the porch like a dog. What was he looking for? And who was he? I sat in the living room, clutching a baseball bat, jumping at every creak and shadow. My wife came downstairs at one point, asking why the lights were still on, and I tried to explain without scaring her. I could tell she thought I was overreacting, but she stayed with me for a while before heading back to bed. I eventually convinced myself it was over and tried to get some sleep. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to another noise, this time from the backyard. It wasn't loud, just a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the patio. My stomach sank. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I crept to the back door and peeked through the blinds, and there he was, standing in the middle of the yard, his back to me again. He wasn't alone this time. There was something lying at his feet, but I couldn't tell what it was in the dim light. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, before slowly crouching down and running his hands over the ground, like he was searching for something again. I was frozen in place, gripping the blinds so tightly they creaked. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest, but I couldn't look away. Whatever he was doing out there, it wasn't normal. I tried to convince myself it was just some random lunatic, but deep down, I knew there was something more to this. The thing at his feet, whatever it was, seemed to twitch. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a dog, but the way it moved wasn't natural. It jerked and spasmed like it was alive, but barely. I thought about calling the police again, but the last thing I wanted was for him to see me. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he stopped moving. He tilted his head up slightly, like he was listening, and then he turned. He looked directly at the window where I was standing. I swear he couldn't have seen me through the blinds. I'd barely lifted them, but he stared right at me, like he knew I was there. My blood went cold. His face was even worse than I remembered. Pale, sunken, and almost wrong. I can't explain it, but something about him didn't look entirely human. He raised one hand and pointed straight at the window. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in the process, and when I looked again, he was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept every light on, pacing back and forth between the living room and the kitchen, checking all the windows like a paranoid maniac. By morning, I was exhausted but too scared to let my guard down. When the sun finally came up, I went out to the backyard to see if there was any sign of what I'd seen the night before. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but then I spotted it, the thing that had been at his feet. It wasn't moving anymore, and as I got closer, I realized it was a dead bird. Its wings were spread out like it had been caught mid-flight, but its neck was twisted at an impossible angle. That wasn't the worst part, though. Around the bird, scratched into the dirt, were symbols, circles and lines, all overlapping and jagged, like something you'd see in an old horror movie. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even take a picture. I just went back inside and locked the door. I kept telling myself it was some sick prank or a homeless guy who'd lost his mind, but the longer I stared at those scratches through the window, the more I felt like it was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about those symbols. I wanted to forget about them, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, those bloodshot eyes, and the way he pointed at me like he knew something I didn't. By the time evening rolled around, I was debating whether I should sleep somewhere else. My wife kept saying it was just a one-time thing, that the guy wouldn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done. Sure enough, just as the sun started to set, I heard something again. This time, it was coming from the side of the house. I grabbed the bat and went to check, my legs shaking with every step. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but then I noticed the window near the kitchen. It was open. Not just open, but wide open, and I knew for a fact I hadn't left it like that. My stomach dropped. I slammed it shut and locked it, but then I heard something behind me, the faintest whisper, like someone saying my name. I spun around, but no one was there. My wife came running in, asking what was wrong, and when I told her, she just stared at me, looking more scared than I'd ever seen her. I convinced my wife to leave the house for the night. She thought I was overreacting, but the look on her face told me she was just as uneasy as I was. We packed a bag and drove to her sister's place across town. As we pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house one last time, and I swear I saw something move in the upstairs window. It wasn't a clear view, just a shadow passing quickly, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. At her sister's house, I finally felt like I could breathe again. We stayed up late, talking about everything that had happened, but even as we tried to laugh it off, there was this lingering tension in the air. Around 2 a.m., I decided to check the security cameras I'd installed around the house a few months back. I hadn't even thought to look at them until that moment. When I pulled up the footage, my blood ran cold. At 3:12 a.m. the night before, there he was, standing at the edge of the backyard, staring directly into one of the cameras. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared for a solid 5 minutes before walking out of frame. I couldn't look away from the footage. I kept replaying it, hoping I'd notice something that would explain who he was or what he wanted, but there was nothing. Just him standing there, completely still, like he was waiting for something. It was the way he looked at the camera that got to me. He didn't seem confused or angry, just aware, like he knew I'd see him eventually. After that, I checked the other cameras, and my stomach dropped when I saw the front porch footage. Around the same time, he'd been there too, crouched low near the door, scratching something onto the wood. I didn't have the nerve to go back and see what he'd left. The footage made it clear he'd been moving around the house all night, circling it like a predator. The last thing I saw before he disappeared was him standing at the end of the driveway, staring up at the bedroom window. He stood there for a long time before he finally walked away, disappearing into the shadows. That's when I shut off the feed. I couldn't watch anymore. I called the police again, but there wasn't much they could do without catching him in the act. One of the officers suggested installing better lights and motion sensors, but I knew that wouldn't stop him. The next day, I went back to the house, though every part of me was screaming not to. My wife stayed behind at her sister's place. She'd had enough. As I pulled into the driveway, everything looked normal at first, but the moment I stepped onto the porch, I saw it. Scratched into the wood, right near the front door, were the same symbols I'd found in the backyard. This time, though, there was something else. A single word carved so deeply into the wood it splintered around the edges. Found. My stomach flipped. Found what? Found who? I couldn't tell if it was a message for me or someone else. I didn't go inside right away. I circled the house, checking every window, every door, to make sure nothing was broken or open. Everything seemed secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally worked up the courage to go in, and the house was just as we'd left it. Lights off, furniture undisturbed. Still, I couldn't relax. I walked through each room, gripping the bat like my life depended on it, until I made it to the kitchen. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but as I got closer to the pantry, it grew stronger. Rotting, metallic, like something dead. My hands were shaking as I opened the door. The pantry was empty, at least at first glance. I stood there for a second, trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, when I noticed something on the floor, a dark, sticky trail leading to the small gap between the pantry shelves and the wall. My heart was pounding as I crouched down to get a better look. The light from my phone's flashlight caught it, a clump of hair, matted and filthy, stuck to the edge of the shelf. I nearly dropped the phone. I wanted to back away, but something compelled me to reach in and pull the shelf aside. When I did, I found the source of the smell. There, crammed into the narrow space, was the same dead bird I'd seen in the backyard. Its wings were folded awkwardly, and its beak was open like it had been gasping for air. The symbols were there too, drawn all around it in what looked like dried blood. My stomach churned as I backed out of the pantry, the bat slipping from my grip. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the living room. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and then I heard it again. A low whisper, just like the night before. Only this time, it wasn't calling my name. It was laughing. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of concrete. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the house, though it still sounded like it was right there in the living room. I forced myself to move, gripping the bat again as I crept toward the sound. The room was empty, or at least I thought it was. The tapping had stopped, but the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. That's when I saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room, darker than anything else, even in the dim light. It didn't move, but it felt alive, like it was watching me. I don't remember making the decision to leave, but suddenly I was outside, slamming the front door behind me. I didn't care about the house anymore. I got in my car and drove straight back to my wife's sister's place. I haven't been back since. The house is still there, sitting empty, and as far as I know, no one else has seen that man or experienced anything strange. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear that same tapping sound, faint and distant, like it's following me. And when I close my eyes, I still see his face, those wild eyes staring straight through me, like he knows a secret I never will. The persistent follower. It started as just another late night. I had worked overtime and decided to walk home instead of waiting for the bus. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 20 minutes tops, but the streets were eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than it should, like the world's holding its breath. I was halfway down a stretch of dimly lit road when I first noticed him. At first, I thought he was just some random guy heading in the same direction, but the way he matched my pace immediately set me on edge. It wasn't like he was behind me the whole time. He'd slow down when I slowed down, speed up when I did. That alone made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a coincidence. But when I crossed the street to see if he'd keep going straight, he crossed too. That's when I started to feel the first waves of panic. My heart wasn't racing yet, but there was this knot forming in my stomach. I tried to act normal, pulling out my phone like I was checking something important, but in reality, I was opening the camera app to catch a glimpse of him without being obvious. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the kind with the drawstrings pulled tight, so his face was mostly shadowed. I couldn't see any details, just the faint glint of his eyes. It made me feel sick, the way he wasn't even trying to be subtle. I decided to take a different route, even though it would add a few minutes to my walk. I turned down a side street that was quieter but better lit, thinking maybe he'd lose interest. For a moment, I felt a sliver of relief. His footsteps weren't behind me anymore. But just as I started to think I was overreacting, I caught sight of him again in the reflection of a shop window. He wasn't following me directly anymore. Instead, he was keeping to the other side of the street, walking just out of the range of the streetlights. That was somehow worse. He was toying with me, like a cat watching a mouse. My hands were shaking at this point. I couldn't tell if it was fear or adrenaline, but my legs felt like they could give out any second. I thought about calling someone, but who? The police? What would I even say? Hey, someone's following me, but I don't know who they are or what they want. It sounded ridiculous even in my head. Instead, I tried to speed up, putting as much distance as I could between us. My apartment building wasn't far now, just a couple of blocks. I kept telling myself, if I can just get home, I'll be safe. Just keep walking. As I approached my apartment building, my body felt like it was moving on autopilot. Heart pounding, every muscle tense. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being pulled between two choices. Sprint to the door and risk looking panicked, or keep my pace steady and hope he'd lose interest. I chose the latter, but my gut was screaming at me that it wasn't going to work. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder, and there he was, closer now than before. He wasn't trying to hide anymore, just walking straight toward me. The keys in my pocket felt like they weighed a ton, and I gripped them so tightly my knuckles hurt. My building has one of those old intercom systems, the kind where you need a key to get through the first door. I reached the entrance and fumbled to unlock it, my fingers clumsy with panic. I could hear his footsteps growing louder behind me, deliberate and steady, like he knew I had nowhere else to go. I finally got the door open and slipped inside, letting it slam shut behind me. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But when I turned to look, he was standing just outside the glass door, staring at me. I froze. He didn't move, didn't try to open the door, just stood there, staring. His face was still obscured by the hoodie, but now that he was so close, I could make out more details. His posture was unnerving. He stood too still, like a statue. His hands were in his pockets, and something about the way he leaned slightly forward made it feel like he was studying me, waiting for me to do something. I felt exposed, like the thin glass between us wasn't enough to keep him out. My breathing was loud in the empty lobby, and for a second, I wondered if he could hear it. I stepped back, my hand hovering over the elevator button, but something made me hesitate. If I got in, I'd be trapped until I reached my floor, and I didn't want to lose sight of him. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, not far, but it felt like a mile. I kept my eyes on him, willing him to leave, to do something, but he just stayed there. The worst part was the way his head tilted slightly, almost like he was amused. That's when I noticed his right hand slowly slipping out of his pocket. My stomach dropped. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. His hand came out of his pocket, and I felt a wave of relief. It was empty. No weapon, nothing threatening. But then he lifted it, slowly, deliberately, and pointed a single finger at me. Not in a threatening way, but like he was saying, "I see you." I felt every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't what I expected, and somehow that made it worse. It was so deliberate, so personal. I took another step back, finally pressing the elevator button without taking my eyes off him. The doors opened with a ding that sounded unnaturally loud, and I scrambled inside, jabbing the button for my floor. As the doors began to close, he moved for the first time, stepping closer to the glass door of the lobby. I held my breath, praying it would stay shut, but he didn't try to open it. Instead, he placed his hand flat against the glass, his face still hidden in shadow. The last thing I saw before the elevator doors slid shut was that hand pressed against the glass, almost like a mark he was leaving behind. When the elevator started moving, I let out a shaky breath, but the feeling of safety didn't come. My chest was tight, and I kept staring at the numbers on the panel as they lit up one by one. It felt like the slowest ride of my life. My mind raced through every possibility. What if he somehow got inside? What if he was waiting for me on my floor? I thought about calling someone, anyone, but my hands were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. When the elevator doors opened to my floor, the hallway felt eerily silent. I stepped out cautiously, glancing both ways, but everything looked normal. The same dim lighting, the same beige walls I saw every day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My apartment was only a few doors down, so I forced myself to move, gripping my keys like a weapon. As I reached my door, I fumbled again, trying to get the key in the lock. That's when I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock, coming from the stairwell door at the far end of the hall. I froze, my key halfway into the lock. The knock wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. 3 slow, deliberate taps. My first thought was that maybe it was one of my neighbors, but the timing felt too coincidental. I turned my head toward the stairwell door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. It was slightly ajar, the dim light from the stairwell spilling into the hallway. I stood there paralyzed, waiting for something to happen, but everything was still, too still. Finally, I forced myself to turn the key and push my door open. I slipped inside and locked it behind me in one motion, sliding every latch and bolt I had. My apartment felt like a safe haven, but only for a moment. I stood there in the dark, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I heard it again. 3 soft knocks, this time on my apartment door. My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard any footsteps in the hallway. Whoever it was, they'd gotten there without making a sound. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The peephole. I needed to check the peephole. But the thought of looking through it terrified me. What if he was standing there, face inches from the glass, staring back? My hands felt clammy, my knees weak, but I couldn't just stand there. I crept toward the door, each step feeling like it took a lifetime. When I finally reached it, I leaned in, just barely peeking through the tiny circle of glass. The hallway was empty. No one was there. I stared for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was over, but something didn't feel right. My instinct screamed at me that he was still there, just out of sight. I stayed by the door for what felt like forever, my ear pressed against the wood, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, just silence. I finally stepped away, telling myself it was done, but deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. I tried to distract myself, pacing the small living room and double-checking that all the windows were locked. But every creak, every gust of wind outside, made my nerves jump. I told myself it was probably just a prank or some weirdo trying to scare me, but that didn't explain how he'd gotten so close without me hearing. I finally sat down on the couch, my back to the wall, and kept my eyes on the door. My phone was in my hand, but I still couldn't bring myself to call anyone. What would I even say? Then I heard it again. A knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps. This time, it came from the window. My stomach dropped. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no balcony, no fire escape, nothing that would make it easy for someone to get up here. I turned my head slowly, and there it was, a shadow, just barely visible through the curtains. My blood ran cold as I stared, paralyzed. The figure stood perfectly still, and even though I couldn't see a face, I felt it watching me. My whole body locked up as I stared at the curtain, the shadow unmoving but unmistakable. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light or a tree branch swaying outside, but there was no wind. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My fight or flight instincts were screaming at me, but I couldn't decide what to do. Slowly, I reached for the edge of the curtain, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grip the fabric. I yanked it back in one quick motion, and there was nothing there. Just the empty night, with the faint glow of the streetlights below. My hands were still shaking as I scanned every inch of the window, looking for some sign that someone had been there. A smudge, a mark, anything, but it was spotless. I stepped back, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. But then I saw it, a single fingerprint, pressed into the glass, right at eye level. The fingerprint was smudged but distinct, like someone had deliberately pressed their finger against the glass and dragged it slightly downward. My stomach turned. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. The realization sent a cold wave of dread through me, and I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the room as if he could somehow be inside already. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating now, pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't know what else to do. I grabbed my phone and finally dialed the police, my fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. When the operator answered, I tried to explain what was happening, but I could barely get the words out. "Someone's been following me," I stammered. "He's outside my window, on the 3rd floor." My voice sounded shaky and desperate, even to me. The operator stayed calm, assuring me help was on the way, but as I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't matter. Whoever this person was, they weren't normal. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline, my eyes darting between the door and the window. Every second felt like an eternity, and I couldn't stop imagining him finding a way in. I thought I heard faint creaks in the hallway outside my apartment, but I was too scared to check. The fingerprint on the glass felt like a taunt, proof that he wasn't just messing with me. He wanted me to know he could get close. Too close. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief started to creep in, but it was quickly overshadowed by dread. Would they find him? Would he just vanish, leaving me with no answers, no closure? I heard the elevator doors ding and the heavy footsteps of officers approaching my apartment. I ran to the door, unlocked it, and let them in. I told them everything, about the man following me, the knocks, the shadow at the window. They searched the hallway, the stairwell, and even checked outside, but there was no sign of him. Not a footprint, not a trace. The officers assured me that they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for anyone matching the description I gave. But I could tell they didn't really believe me. They chalked it up to a prank or a case of paranoia after a long day. I didn't argue with them. I just nodded and thanked them, desperate for them to stay longer, even though I knew they wouldn't. When they finally left, the silence in my apartment felt louder than ever. I double-checked all the locks again, but it didn't help. The thought of going to bed felt impossible, so I stayed in the living room, every light on, my phone clutched in my hand. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over because I woke up to the pale light of dawn streaming through the window. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. But then I saw it. On the outside of the glass, written in the faint streak of condensation from the morning air, were 3 words: "Found you again."